It's 8:30 a.m. on August 6, 1945. Fluorescent lights hum in the underground bunkers beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. The humid summer air carries the weight of a nation at war for nearly 4 years. Staff officers in sweat-stained khaki uniforms plot pins on massive wall maps that show the shrinking perimeter of the Japanese Empire. General Korechika Anami, Japan's war minister, strides through the corridors with the bearing of a career soldier who has never known defeat. At 58, his face holds the confidence of a man who believes absolutely in Japan's divine destiny. The morning briefing should be routine, overnight reports from garrison commanders, and updates on the massive Ketsugo defense preparations, which were designed to make any American invasion so costly that the enemy would sue for peace. But something is wrong. The communication board for the Chugoku Military District shows nothing. There are no morning reports from Hiroshima's 2nd General Army Headquarters, no updates from the 400,000 civilians and military personnel in Japan's 8th largest city. Operators twist their radio dials, hearing only static where there should be the familiar crackle of field reports. "Sir," a young communications officer stammers, "we've lost all contact with Hiroshima, all military frequencies, all civilian radio. Everything went silent at approximately 8:15 this morning." Anami's dark eyes narrow. In 4 years of total war, entire cities don't simply vanish from the communication grid. Not cities with major military headquarters, and not cities that were just hours ago reporting normal defensive preparations. What force on earth could instantly silence 340,000 people? You have to understand the mindset of the 6 men who controlled Japan's fate in August 1945. They called themselves the Supreme War Council, or the Big Six. They genuinely believed they held the keys to victory, even as American B-29s turned their cities to ash night after night. The Big Six included General Anami, Admiral Somu Toyota, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. Here's what made them so dangerously confident. They knew secrets the Americans couldn't possibly imagine. Since 1940, Japan had been racing to build its own atomic bomb. They had 2 separate programs, the Army's NI-GO project and the Navy's F-GO program. The Army's project was under Dr. Yoshio Nishina, one of the world's leading nuclear physicists who had worked with Niels Bohr. Nishina understood the theoretical foundations of atomic fission better than almost anyone alive. That knowledge had taught him something crucial. Building atomic bombs was virtually impossible. The uranium enrichment alone required industrial facilities beyond imagination, massive electromagnetic separation plants, thousands of tons of uranium ore, and electrical power consumption that would drain entire regions. Japan's leading scientists had calculated that even the mighty United States could produce perhaps 1 or 2 atomic weapons at most. So when the morning reports began filtering in, scattered, contradictory, barely believable, the military leaders dismissed them with the confidence of men who possessed superior knowledge. A small number of B-29s attacked Hiroshima with a new type bomb. "Considerable damage observed," read the first coherent report from a reconnaissance plane. Admiral Toyota, chief of the Naval General Staff, barely looked up from his strategic maps. He had survived the massive B-29 raids that had already destroyed 42 major Japanese cities. He dismissed it, saying it was probably a concentrated incendiary attack. But as the hours passed, the reports grew stranger. Train schedules to Hiroshima were indefinitely suspended. Military communications remained completely severed. Most unsettling of all, a weather reconnaissance plane reported seeing something unprecedented. A mushroom-shaped cloud rising nearly 40,000 feet into the sky. Then came President Truman's radio announcement, transmitted by shortwave and picked up by Japanese monitors. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. The silence in the Supreme War Council meeting room was deafening. General Anami finally spoke, his voice carrying the studied calm of a career military officer. "The Americans are engaged in psychological warfare," he declared. "Even if they have developed some form of atomic device, the technical requirements make mass production impossible. Our own research confirms this." Toyota nodded grimly, adding that if the Americans possessed an arsenal of such weapons, they would have used them months ago. "This is clearly a desperate gambit, perhaps their only such device." What they couldn't know was that their scientific expertise had become their greatest weakness. Their research had taught them exactly how difficult the task was, blinding them to American industrial capabilities they couldn't fathom. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 workers, consumed more electricity than entire nations, and represented the largest secret industrial undertaking in human history. The Japanese military leaders were making decisions based on what they knew was possible, but they were fighting an enemy that had redefined the possible itself. As August 6th turned to August 7th, these 6 men clung to their certainty with the desperation of drowning sailors. They had no idea their entire world was about to change forever. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, the leading nuclear physicist, took an 11-hour train journey from Tokyo to the ruins of Hiroshima. Theory and reality are separated by a chasm, and on August 7, 1945, Nishina crossed that chasm. For miles before reaching the city, he saw trees stripped of leaves and telephone poles snapped like matchsticks, along with a strange acrid smell. Then the train tracks ahead were twisted into impossible spirals. Nishina walked the final 5 miles into what had been Hiroshima. Nothing had prepared him for what he found. Buildings hadn't just collapsed, they had been vaporized. Human shadows were burned permanently into concrete walls, the ghostly outlines of people who had been walking to work. The hypocenter was a perfect circle of absolute destruction, extending for miles. Most haunting of all were the survivors. Nishina found himself face to face with radiation sickness, a phenomenon that existed only in theoretical physics papers until that moment. Victims' skin was literally falling off, people were vomiting blood, and hair was falling out in clumps. He took measurements with his Geiger counter, the clicking growing frantic as he approached ground zero. This wasn't just an explosive device, this was the fundamental forces of the universe unleashed on a human city. Everything he thought he knew about the limits of atomic weapons had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council was about to receive news that would make Hiroshima seem like a mere prelude. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, as the Big Six were finally meeting to discuss the Hiroshima reports, an aide burst into the conference room. Nagasaki has been attacked with another atomic bomb. Another bomb, just 3 days later. In that moment, every assumption the Japanese military leadership had clung to disintegrated like paper in flames. If the Americans had 2 atomic bombs, they could have 3 or 10 or 100. The entire foundation of Japan's defensive strategy, to bleed the Americans severely during the invasion so they would negotiate, had just become meaningless. Why would America invade when they could simply erase Japanese cities from existence one by one until nothing remained but radioactive wasteland? But even faced with this apocalyptic reality, General Anami couldn't surrender his vision of honorable death over dishonored survival. "Would it not be wondrous," he asked, his voice carrying an eerie poetry, "for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower?" Here was a man so committed to the warrior's code that he would choose national extinction over national surrender. Reality was about to intrude in the most devastating way possible. On August 10th, the Japanese military captured an American fighter pilot named Marcus McDilda, shot down 2 days after Hiroshima. Under interrogation, which included torture, McDilda provided information that would finally shatter the Japanese military's resistance. The problem was, McDilda knew absolutely nothing about atomic bombs. He was a conventional fighter pilot who had never been briefed on nuclear weapons. But faced with torture and desperate to survive, he told his captors what he thought they wanted to hear. The Americans, McDilda claimed, had over 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. Tokyo would be next, followed by Kyoto, then Osaka. Every major Japanese city would be obliterated within weeks. None of this was true. In reality, the United States had exactly 0 atomic bombs remaining. The next weapon wouldn't be ready until late August. But McDilda's desperate lies contained just enough technical-sounding detail to be believable to interrogators who were grasping for any information about this incomprehensible new weapon. When McDilda's fabricated intelligence reached the Supreme War Council, it landed like a final crushing blow. War Minister Anami, the man who had spoken so poetically about national destruction, stood before his colleagues with the weight of absolute defeat in his voice. The Americans appear to have 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. The next target might well be Tokyo. These men had commanded millions of soldiers and orchestrated campaigns across the Pacific, never knowing defeat. But they were facing a weapon that made their military expertise as obsolete as samurai swords in the age of machine guns. Still, incredibly, they remained deadlocked. 3 votes for surrender, 3 votes to continue fighting even against atomic annihilation. It would take an intervention unprecedented in Japanese history to break the stalemate. Just before midnight on August 9, 1945, something happened that hadn't occurred in over 1,000 years of Japanese history. Emperor Hirohito, the living god who traditionally remained above earthly decisions, entered a conference room and personally broke a government deadlock. The emperor, small in stature but carrying the weight of divine authority, spoke words that would end not just a war, but an entire way of thinking about warfare itself. "I have given serious consideration to the situation at home and abroad," Hirohito said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We must bear the unbearable and suffer what is insufferable." In that moment, Japan's military leaders faced the ultimate choice between honor and survival. Some, like Prime Minister Suzuki, accepted the new reality. Others, like General Anami, chose a different path. On August 15th, hours before the emperor's surrender broadcast, Anami performed ritual seppuku in his home. He died as he had lived, according to the warrior's code that atomic weapons had rendered obsolete. He never acknowledged that the world had fundamentally changed. But perhaps the most tragic figure was Admiral Toyota, who had so confidently declared that Americans couldn't have many atomic bombs. After the war, when the full scope of the Manhattan Project was revealed and he learned that American industrial capacity had accomplished what Japanese scientists considered impossible, Toyota reportedly spent hours staring at photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in complete silence. The atomic bombings didn't just end World War II. They marked the end of an entire military philosophy based on honor, sacrifice, and conventional warfare. Modern military planners study this story not just as history, but as a warning about the dangers of cognitive blindness in leadership. How expertise can become a prison. The story of Japan's military leadership in August 1945 remains painfully relevant today. It reminds us that the greatest military disasters often come not from external enemies, but from the internal inability to adapt to new realities. The Japanese military couldn't believe America's atomic bomb's devastating power because they had convinced themselves it was impossible. Their scientific knowledge, their professional expertise, their cultural confidence all became weapons used against them. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the certainty that you understand the rules of the game, even when someone else has already changed them forever.